Welcome to this Conveyancing Matters chat. This is another in our series of Conveyancing Around the World. And today we're delighted to welcome Roberto, who is a property lawyer from Italy. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
So, Lorraine, we're here again.
We are indeed, Stu. We are indeed. Another in our Conveyancing Around the World chats. And really delighted to welcome Roberto, who's an Italian property lawyer. He'll tell us a little bit about himself in a minute. But for the benefit of those watching, as you know, we've done a number of Conveyancing Around the World chats, and I'm delighted to say that Roberto sort of got in touch as a result of seeing those, advertised on LinkedIn. And Roberto, just to welcome you, and also just to give a little bit of context, as we were saying off air, the last 2 years in the conveyancing world in England and Wales have frankly been pretty grim for property lawyers. Huge volumes of work, enormous amounts of pressure, delayed transaction times, and that's led a lot of people within the industry and indeed outside it to claim that the conveyancing process in England and Wales is broken. So that's what led Stu and I to think that it would be lovely to talk to people such as yourself from other jurisdictions about the process of buying and selling property in their particular jurisdiction. So we're delighted to welcome you, Roberto. So before we perhaps kick off, would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're based? I think Stu and I wish we'd been able to do this one face to face. I think with you, we'd have come to see you. So over to you, Roberto.
Of course. Well, thank you, Lorraine, and thank you, Stu. I'm delighted to join you for this conversation on Conveyancing Matters. As you were saying, I'm a lawyer from Italy. I'm a duly qualified lawyer, in fact, as I'm also a solicitor. But I'm based in Italy since 2000, and I've ever since carried on my practice. And one of the key areas of the business of my practice is property. So I've been doing it for a fair number of years. One of the key elements to be noted about our conveyancing system is that there are two main types of lawyers involved in this kind of transactions. One is the notary public, and I'm not a notary public. I'll explain in a minute what is my qualification, but a notary public is the only lawyer who is absolutely vital to the transaction because he is the conveyancer, namely the professional before whom title is transferred from the vendor to the purchaser. And he is also a public official for that purposes. He is a professional who records the transaction on the land registry, and he is the professional entitled to collect the money from the purchaser, pass it on to the vendor, collect the stamp duty, and pay it over to the tax authorities. I am an avvocato, an advocate, which basically means a lawyer with a different kind of qualification. I could represent clients in court, but I could provide as a and I've chosen to assist and advise clients in conveyancing for a number of years, because my role and the role of a notary are very often complementary with one another. A notary also, importantly, is independent in the sense that he may not take side for either the vendor and the purchaser. And of course, there is a potential conflict of interest between the two parties. Whilst in my case, of course, I would be appointed either by the vendor or by the purchaser. So my goal would be to protect that my client and to protect his best interest, which is a bit different.
So that's really interesting. So the role of the notary that you've described there, I mean, I think it's fair to say, Stu, would be largely what what you do in practice, Stu.
Yeah, most definitely. It's I wonder whether that gives it a bit more sort of certainty as to what's happening. Where I think in the UK there's so much sort of backwards and forwards, and somebody telling somebody else that this has happened or not happened, and the estate agents getting involved. Maybe by having that middle person, it's a bit more rigid and a bit more factual.
As I suppose the most assistants on civil law, like France and Spain, a notary is certainly a role of certainty for both parties. Unfortunately, however, notaries get always involved at a later stage of the transaction, which means not really from the outset. What does it mean? It means that a notary gets often instructed before completion. Just to make it clearer, there are different stages in the transaction in Italy, pretty much like in England and Wales. We start usually from an offer, especially when an estate agent is involved.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll cut in there, Roberto. I was going to ask you, so you have the sort of, I mean, I've sort of, swanned hopefully round Italy, looking wistfully in estate agents' windows, wishing I could live there. But so that's a very sort of similar setup to here. If someone, broadly speaking, wants to sell their property, they will instruct an estate agent who will do all the marketing and all the things that we would normally expect an agent to do. Buyer will come along, estate agent will sort of negotiate the price between buyer and seller, and then what happens to the buyer and the seller at that point? Will they always appoint a separate avvocato each, Roberto, or not?
No, they wouldn't, especially for small transactions.
What's your definition of small?
Where I would reckon something within the region of 50 to 100,000 euros.
Okay.
Or if the transaction, however, with a higher value, with a higher agreed price, is nevertheless straightforward. Or when both parties are Italian, which means they are familiar with the language, they're familiar with the process, they don't feel they needed to be particularly protected, because with a little bit of tips here and there, they believe to be covered, although that is not always the case. When they find out about that, it's too late. But especially with the complex transactions or high value transactions, or whenever the purchaser is a first time buyer, or a UK-based clients, that's when, for instance, the process gets different. A lawyer like me gets involved, and the stages of the transactions might slightly different from the standard.
So what about and Stu, I know this is the sort of bane of your life. I mean, maybe I know Roberto knows the process over here very well, but maybe for the benefit of those watching, I mean, Stu, mention to Roberto, and let's maybe compare and contrast, the bane of your life in terms of sort of title investigation and searches in particular, because I'm really interested to know the parallels between England.
Well, what I was going to ask, Lorraine, was that obviously the bane of our life is probably going to be the money laundering and the ID check. So, Roberto, when would that take place? Would that be when you get given your client? And if certain clients don't have legal representation, who then deals with the aspect of money laundering and linking clients to property?
As soon as Stu, as soon as a client approaches me and signs a letter of engagement,
Yeah.
that's the minute I'm obliged to go through money laundering procedures.
That's the same as the UK then.
Same as the UK. But suppose I'm not getting involved, it depends whether an estate agent is appointed, and an estate agent would have equivalent obligations to comply with his own anti-money laundering procedures. Equally speaking, the notary. So whenever a separate professional is involved to cover a separate role, including the notary public, a notary public as well would have to go through his own money laundering formalities.
So does that mean, Roberto, that somebody, for example, and again, forgive me for butting in, but a buyer, for example, who's got their, chunk of money sitting in a bank account, so they could have identification and AML carried out by the agent, by their avvocato, and by the notary, or if it's been done once by one of those professionals, it doesn't have to be done again?
It is a good policy that each individual professional who is involved in the transaction carries out his own due diligence on his client. The clients might be different. For instance, for the bank, it would only be the borrower. For the notary, it would be both clients as well as for an agent. But for me, it would only be due diligence for money laundering purposes in respect of the client who appoints me. So and you can't take for granted that the due diligence made by another professional involved in this transaction has been done properly. So
that's a really big issue over here, isn't it, Stu?
Exactly the same. Yeah, exactly the same. So Roberto, once then you've carried out your money laundering checks, you're happy that you've sort of validated your client is who they say they are, what would be the next steps? I mean, here we obviously we've got the land registry, so we would pull down title, prepare a pack and send that to the buyer's lawyer. Would it be similar in Italy? Is it similar sort of thing with the land registry?
It would be fairly similar to, it all depends whether an estate agent is involved or not.
Okay.
Because obviously the estate agent, as Lorraine was saying, very similarly to what happens in the UK, would have been appointed by the vendor. So the agent would have a package available at the start of the transaction, including a fair amount of documents, including searches, including copies of the title deeds, and these would be ready to be handed over to a purchaser as soon as an offer gets accepted. When I get involved, it depends very much on when that happens, because if no agent has been appointed yet, or is not going to be appointed, suppose the two parties know each other and they are more or less ready to make a deal between them without having to rely on the assistance of an agent, I would have to make my own package of legal information and searches and collect all the other documents instead of an estate agent. So it very much depends on the type of transaction which is put before me.
Would you say, Roberto, what sort of percentage of transactions, generally speaking, have an estate agent involved? I mean, would it be the majority, or is it, so would a pack be produced up front in most transactions, or is it, less so?
Well, it would be, I would reckon, Lorraine, maybe about 80% of transactions are covered by estate agents. And if a foreign purchaser is involved, 100%. almost inevitably, or maybe 95%.
Yeah, you see, that's the likes of me, Roberto, wandering around looking wistfully in estate agents' windows like that. I was lucky enough to be in Italy this summer, only for a couple of weeks, of course, and just sort of kept looking through windows, thinking, oh, if I sold everything, could I buy that? I was thinking, well, I could still work. But Roberto,
Absolutely.
oh, do you know, I nearly did it a few years ago, and I'm now I'm freelance and sitting on Zoom all the time. I'm thinking, oh gosh, perhaps I could do it. But
you can still do it.
Yes,
come to sunny Italy.
Oh, don't. Honestly, I'd be there like a shot, Roberto. I can tell you, I love it. Roberto, can I just drill down a little bit? There's two things. Before Stu, quite frankly, rudely interrupted me earlier, and we got to AML.
Always.
Yeah. Get in there, Stu. I'm interested to know, Roberto, kind of a couple of things really. Particularly if the parties don't each appoint an avvocato such as yourself, is how complex or otherwise is title investigation in Italy? I mean, we got the impression, for example, when we talked to a lovely lady, Nikki Miller, who works out of California, that really, frankly, Stu, it's fair to say there really wasn't much to worry about in terms of title in California, was there? But we've got much more over here. So how does the title investigation work? Because that's often what can cause issues over here, as you know.
Well, again, Lorraine, it depends on the kind of transaction, because it can be a fairly straightforward operation if, say, the purchase regards a residential apartment in a council block, for instance, or in a residential property somewhere, maybe in Venice. It would be fairly straightforward. Where it would get difficult is, for instance, if the property includes some land, and there may be investigations to make about boundaries or about easements, or maybe the property is being sold by the beneficiaries of an estate, and maybe the property has been inherited through a sequence of different successions. So, for instance, a title is split among a large number of beneficiaries, and it is a bit difficult to find out who knows what at the end of the day.
Oh, you see, because, well, as you well know, Roberto, we've got our two trustee rule over here. Don't want to sound like a lecturer, but of course, generally speaking, our probate colleagues over here, our private client colleagues, will worry about multiple beneficiaries. But of course, from a legal point of view here, if we've got two trustees and the purchase money is paid to two trustees, we don't have to worry about all those people behind the scenes. So are you saying in Italy, Roberto, if there's 15 people who might be entitled to the proceeds of a bit of land in Italy, that they would all essentially have to be accounted for in the conveyancing process?
Absolutely. We recently dealt with the purchase by an English client of ours, by the way, of a villa in Sicily, and there were 13 vendors, all members of the same family.
Did they all agree with each other?
Oh, they did indeed. Yeah. They were eager, unfortunately, to dispose of their family property because they could no longer afford to upkeep it. And so they were all in agreement. They were in agreement with the price and everything else. So from that, in that respect, it wasn't too difficult.
Goodness me, Stu, can you imagine dealing with 13 vendors?
Yeah, what a nightmare it would be. Bad enough having one or two, isn't it? Crikey.
Yeah, exactly. And the joys of overreaching. The joys of overreaching. So, Roberto, can you tell us, please, when, at what point in what we might call an average Italian conveyancing transaction, at what point does the matter become legally binding between seller and buyer? And at what point is the legal title transferred? So we've obviously got the two-stage process, as you know, exchange and then completion. So how does that work in your jurisdiction?
Well, as I said, whenever a vendor employs an estate agent, the process normally provides for an offer to be made by the purchaser to the vendor, particularly if it is felt that there is going to be a strong demand for that particular property. That basically means that between the two parties, there is a binding agreement as soon as the offer is accepted. What usually happens is that a small deposit is given by the purchaser in the hands of the estate agent. And if the purchaser decides for any reason not to progress with the purchase, he may well lose that small amount of money. But if not, that becomes a part of a larger deposit, which is normally paid when the parties exchange a contract at a later stage. The main difference between an offer and a proper contract is that the contract which is signed at exchange is at least it's not only all the information relating to the price, to the date of completion, but also some of the warranties the purchaser would want the vendor to stick to, and other provisions which will not otherwise be included in a standard offer. The deposit at that stage is likely to be up to 10% of the agreed price, unlike the small amount which is paid in the hands of the estate agent when the offer gets accepted.
And what sort of time frame then, Roberto, is there between exchange and legal completion?
Well, the whole process from the very start takes normally between 4 to 12 weeks. But obviously, for more complex transactions, it may take longer. But say the average range is between a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 12 weeks.
Did you see today, Stu? Actually, there's a report in the property media that transaction times are finally coming down a bit.
I don't know if they're ever as bad as people made them out to be, but that's another story for another day. I think what Roberto's talking about is almost like quite a lot of people's idealistic way the conveyancing market would run in the UK. Upfront information, reservation agreements, and pre-contract.
That's exactly what I've written down. Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like our sort of media friends have kind of had a chat with Roberto already, written down all the ideas, and they're kind of punting them for the ideal way it would work in the UK.
Well, I think what we need to do, Stu, is you and I clearly need to go to Italy and carry out some detailed research.
Definitely, without doubt. It sounds about right.
You are most welcome, and we may do that, maybe sitting together in the sunshine, enjoying a nice ice cream.
That sounds lovely. I have to say, Roberto, I've got to ask you, did you mention the V word? Did you say Venice? Did you actually say Venice? So physically, where are you sitting now, Roberto?
I did indeed. No, at the moment I'm sitting at home, and I live just outside Venice, not very miles far from Venice, but our offices are in the Venice island itself, at the tip of the one tip of the island of Venice. So I feel very privileged about that.
Yeah,
you'd be more than welcome, Roberto, for me to extend the offer and you to come over to Basildon. You've just got to be very careful where you leave your wallet if you do come over. That's the only
thing. No, I'm sure I won't.
Yeah,
You're
and you'll
being
need a
far
coat.
too pessimistic. But going back
Roberto,
If I may,
sorry, go on.
going back just for a second to the ideal world of Italian conveyancing, although it pretty much sounds like that in principle, of course, each transaction is different from the other. And it depends from the peculiarities because, of course, there are always complications around the corner. If, for instance, the purchaser seeks a mortgage, the transaction becomes much more complicated. If the property involved is a listed property, the time scale would be more stretched, more diluted, and there may be more complications to be dealt with. So that's the average time, but it pretty much depends on the individual transaction.
I think it's very similar to the UK. I think too many people here are trying to sort of automate everything and make it sort of one size fits all. And people often forget that every single property has a separate title and they're all completely different, with different people buying them in different financial situations. So trying to make something one size fits all is very difficult.
And let's not forget as well that on completion, the parties must attend in person, which basically means that they need to appear in front of a notary. Because the exchange of money is made in front of a notary, there are hardly ever banker transfers involved, and the payment is made by handing over to the vendor banker's drafts, which are pre-arranged, and the parties needed to attend in person. So imagine what happened during the COVID era, when it was hardly possible for the parties to appear. And nevertheless, conveyancing has gone on. It has been more difficult, but notaries have been available for booking with all health precautions possible. And in fact, in 2021, there has been even an increase in the property transactions compared with 2020.
That's really interesting. Actually, we spoke to a lovely South African lawyer based in Cape Town called Chris Fick. He's lovely, and he said actually in the period of COVID, and of course, to be fair, I would say Italy and South Africa had it particularly bad, particularly early, for a particularly long time, I would say, in many ways. And he was saying, Roberto, that actually what was happening is that they have to have sort of in-person visits to the title office in their locality, and some lawyers were having to sort of get up at sort of 4 or 5 in the morning to go and sort of stand in this queue to try and get these transactions through. And it's, as Stu just said, everything's become very, very prop tech, very property technology, very automated, very at arm's length here. But one thing I wanted to ask you actually, Roberto, because you mentioned the M word, the mortgage word, and of course, and again, Stu would certainly say, massive bane of our lives over here is when the buyer's conveyancer will act for the buyer and the lender. But in the Italian system, Roberto, do the lenders would they be separately represented by a separate lawyer, or do they have their own lawyers? How does that sort of work? What money laundering checks do they do? If I'm getting, putting 100,000 euros of my own money in, and I'm getting a mortgage of, 200,000 euros to buy a property, whether from an international bank or an Italian-based bank, how do the checks on behalf of the lender in relation to my 100,000 euros sort of happen?
Well, lenders would normally have their own in-house lawyers, but at some stage they would be also helped by the notary. The notary is, I didn't say this, but not only is he an independent professional, but he also presides over to the transfer, making sure that the title transfer is valid and effective for all purposes under Italian law. So a notary would also have all the benefit, all the interest, all the accuracy possible to make sure that the bank is happy in his preliminary inquiries and investigations about title. The anti-money laundering checks a bank would normally carry out would not be very different from anti-money laundering checks a professional would make. And obviously, identification of the borrower would be fundamental, would have to be done at the very outset. There would be verification of identity. Obviously, all the documents to be provided for that, and including identity card and passport, would have to be recent. The bank would also make all the other investigations that are required about the provenance of the money to make sure that the provenance is sufficiently safe, and there are a number of guidelines and provisions which also alerts banks and professionals about signs of anomaly about the transaction. For instance, if the asking price is too low, that is certainly not a good sign of, or if a disproportionate amount of money is asked by the vendor, that is also something which must sound odd to the bank, and there are a large number, far too many to be listed, but there are very strict guidelines to follow, also about the nature of the transaction, about its features, which must be taken into consideration.
So Roberto, and again, this is a big deal for Stu and law firm owners over here. You know, if potentially three parties have done ID and AML on a client, estate agent, avvocato, notary, maybe even the bank, and there is fraud or money laundering, where does the liability for that lie? Because Stu, I think, you know,
it's stole my thunder.
Yeah.
Exactly what I was thinking. Where does the liability lie?
The apportionment of a liability would be a terrible job to be done for the lawyers and the court who would be involved with the criminal and civil litigation we would ensue out of the fraud. It may be difficult to say, but maybe I wouldn't say that the bank is on the front line, but obviously, obviously there is a high risk that the bank is in a front line, especially if the fraud involves the borrower. If the fraud involves the vendor, maybe it would be more likely that an estate agent is in the front line, but there isn't a hard and fast rule. It would very much depend on the circumstances of the specific case.
Do you all have to have professional indemnity insurance in place?
Well, certainly estate agents, notary publics, and avvocati like myself would.
Another big deal for you, Stu.
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly the same question. Exactly that. So going back to the notary, if they're completely independent, who pays them? How do they get instructed? Is it something that's jointly done between the buyer and seller?
Well, there is a custom that a notary is appointed by the purchaser.
Okay.
to give him the slight advantage of having a feel he's better looked after, which he wouldn't, because a notary, as I said at the outset, may not take side for either party. So if there is an issue to be negotiated between the buyer and the seller, a notary will not be able to provide advice or suggestion to either party. But yes, a notary would be appointed by the buyer. And while lawyers like myself might well be appointed by a seller, for instance, in many cases, I dealt with previous purchasers, and now my clients are maybe too old. They live in the UK, they are retired and live in the UK. They may no longer be able to come and spend their lovely holidays in Italy, and they would want to sell their property, as it happened a few days ago to some clients who own a lovely villa just outside Venice.
Sounds absolutely fantastic. Frankly, Roberto, you're doing nothing to dissuade me from running over there and trying to get qualified. So, Roberto, I mean, this is all been fascinating, and as Stu said, there are certainly absolutely elements of the process over there that people are banging the drum about over here, particularly the sort of, as Stu has already said, the reservation agreement sort of idea up front, and certainly the title and search information up front. So, I mean, this sounds a slight sort of game show question in a way, Roberto, but maybe in conclusion, if what would you say is probably the most effective or the kind of best bit about the process in your jurisdiction? And of course, conversely, if there was something you could change or something that didn't, you don't think works as well, what do you think is the drawback? So sort of best and worst bits of property transfers in Italy, would you say?
Well, I share the ideas of a large part of the public opinion, which is pressing the government for a change in the fact that notaries alone might be appointed as conveyancers officially. There have been suggestions and proposals made for lawyers like myself to hand over small transactions up, for instance, to 100,000 euros. And I think it would, although, as we were saying at the beginning, notaries have added a lot to the safety of this transaction, especially in the past, and they still do at present. Nonetheless, there are a large number of very straightforward transactions which could take place in a very short space of time, whereby there would be no need for notaries to be bothered. It wouldn't add much to their financial earnings, and they could easily be dealt with by lesser qualified lawyers like advocates and people like myself, and be perfectly well handled by people like ourselves. I think that is probably the biggest advantage, and at the same time the biggest disadvantage of our system, which overall, I must say, works fairly well. Where I think the system may also be improved is that sometimes the purchaser underestimates the complexities of the purchase and involves us at a late stage when maybe a problem has already arisen. And for instance, it would be prudent to appoint an advocate when an offer is about to be made, or if there are doubts that a survey might be advisable. In order to take a larger number of precautions, because we would be having the experience to advise them, and it is down to us lawyers, to advocates, to make a good marketing of our role and make the public at large understand how useful would be our services from an early stage of the transaction.
Well, that's definitely something that you've been saying for a long time over here, Stu, isn't it? About how we as property lawyers, frankly, aren't that good at promoting what we do.
Selling. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, there's similarities here, isn't there? If we got instructed at a much earlier stage, it would most definitely help. It's really interesting to speak to you, Roberto, because there are so many similarities to what the UK market could look like if
one remarkable, Stu, sorry to interrupt, it just occurred to me one important difference to highlight about your system and our system, which is that, as we know, in the UK you have a subject to contract. Now in Italy there is no such thing as a subject to contract. That basically means that when the purchaser makes an offer which is accepted, that is already a contract. So that's quite important to remember. So there is a binding agreement there, and there it is at a very early stage of the transaction, which is why I thought it would also be important to consult or appoint an advocate to make sure that the offer is in order.
What would that be subject to then, Roberto? Would it be subject to mortgage, subject to survey?
Well, it may well depend on that. Absolutely, yeah. For instance, if a mortgage is sought by the purchaser, even the contract exchanged is well likely to be subject to the mortgage. So there is a binding agreement, but only on condition that the offer to obtain the mortgage is actually accepted by the bank and that the mortgage is actually granted. So there is a bit of an uncertainty about whether the transaction will have a happy ending until nearly the very end, because of course the bank would go through all its investigations, would appoint a surveyor, and it would have to be happy about the valuation of the property and make sure that the property is suitable as a security before finalizing the mortgage.
So it's interesting. So in a way, our system has sort of evolved to really ensure that all of those things are in place, prior to the contract coming into being. And then we just have a very short time between exchange and completion. So I guess there's pros and cons on both sides, really. So, Stu, have you got any sort of final, observations or questions for Roberto?
No, I think that's it. I think you've explained it really well, Roberto. And like I said earlier, it's really interesting that there's so many similarities to what most people want the English property market and conveyancing process to actually look like. So it's funny. I suppose, I'm not sure if you'd agree, Lorraine, this is probably the most similar chat we've had to somebody in terms of the process that is here, isn't it? It's probably
I think
the most
so.
similar. Yeah,
I think so, definitely.
What I've tried to do, because of my dual qualification, maybe is to highlight a bit too much similarities rather than the difference. But yes, there are many similarities. Probably the main differences would arise as a specific transaction comes under scrutiny. This is when you may probably realize how much different the two systems could possibly be.
Well, Roberto, that's really, really fascinating, really interesting, and it's just been a delight to talk to you. So, Stu and I are really, really grateful. Well, I'm very grateful for fact that you're connected on LinkedIn, and I'm just really delighted that you've been willing to join us and share your experience, because I know there's lots of people over here that watch these that, as I say, are finding them interesting. I know there's quite a few organisations watching them, thinking, oh, let's see what we can take from this. So, Roberto, it's very, very kind of you to join us. So thanks ever so much.
It's been a great pleasure for me, and thank you both for having me today. And obviously, whenever you decide in the near future to expand a bit on any aspects of property transactions, just let me know. I'll be very happy to have another chat.
Whenever. Oh, bless you. No. Well, I think Stu, we'd like to go visit, wouldn't we?
Definitely has to be done in person. That's going to be compulsory this time.
I think so.
Let's try and arrange a meeting in person on a trip in the near future to Italy, to Venice, or wherever you prefer. I'll be very happy wherever you decided to be, and I'll be there with you.
Oh, bless you. Well, Roberto,
next week, you available next week?
Oh yes, absolutely.
I can honestly see Stu and I taking you up on that, Roberto. Thanks
whenever,
so much
whenever.
Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
And
bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Take care.